I should say that I definitely did not do this on my own. Stuart Capsick, and Mark, and also Graham, to be fair, and all the reviewers have input quite a lot into this. So I'm just going to run through the key aspects that we've highlighted in the report, but more than happy to discuss details, and please go and have a look at the report as well. In terms of the context, Graham's already kind of gone through this. We really wanted to focus on impact specifically in terms of evaluation, not just evaluating kind of the design and the process in climate assemblies, but more the outcomes and the impacts. And also with a little bit of a focus on pathways to impacts, or a strong focus on pathway to impacts, understanding what are some of the, or how can we look at the enabling kind of factors for creating the impacts that we want to achieve. Also, as Graham mentioned, it's not really just about short-term or outcomes that just sort of happened without being intended. So, for example, a lot of evaluations look rightly at what happens with assembly members, but it's a very small part of what a potential impact could be. And also we wanted to make it specific to climate assemblies, and we've had a lot of conversations about what that means and go into more detail about this, but really this understanding that climate change is a very complex problem, and it might require complex solutions or systemic solutions. So impacts for climate assemblies might look, or the aims of climate assemblies might be different for assemblies on other topics. And yeah, I've just put on the slides, so we're kind of broadly presenting this to anyone who's interested in impact evaluation of climate assemblies, from people who are commissioning them, people who are actually evaluating them, but also people who are advocating for climate assemblies, for example. And it's not a how-to guide. I would love to write that, but that would probably take me another 10 years because I never have time for these things that I want to do. But it's more of a framework to hopefully inform systemic and robust analysis of the impact of climate assemblies, so we can understand what works and what doesn't work, or share learning in that sense. And yes, as Graham also mentioned, we are hoping to draw attention to the diversity of the possible impacts that could be had. That's not to say that all climate assemblies should have all of these impacts, but it's more to think about all the possible impacts that could be achieved and potentially that also aimed for. And yeah, providing a conceptual guide to enable the evaluation of those impacts, to understand whether we are actually, or the climate assemblies are actually having those impacts. And there's also a little bit of an addition and thinking around intended and unintended consequences or impacts of climate assemblies. So it's kind of recognizing that we should be holding those who are running climate assemblies or using climate assemblies to account, in the sense of, what are they trying to do, and are they actually achieving that? But also paying attention to unintended consequences, both positive and negative. I mean, obviously, I'd like to think about it that there might be unintended consequences in a positive sense, that is driving action in an area where we weren't necessarily aiming for change, but it might also have unintended consequences that it might heighten, for example, kind of coalition forces against kind of recommendations of climate assemblies, for example. The report is split into part 1 and part 2, which you will have seen if you've looked at it. One is kind of broadly framed around understanding the framework, and the next one is the second part is around implementing the framework. I'm going to mostly focus on part 1, which is sort of has these 10 considerations that we go through. Part 2 is really about providing more detail and examples of what we mean by different forms of impact. I'll draw from them a little bit, but do have a read of those in more detail if you're interested. And it's a start. So part 2 has some examples of where we think, the different climate assemblies might have had impacts. And I'm really interested to hear other examples that people might have. Okay, so the first part is around conceptualizing and identifying impacts. This is really the crux of it, and it's this idea that we want to consider the breadth and diversity of possible impacts before planning and evaluation, ideally, and also think about who might be impacted, or who the climate assembly is for, and thinking about issues of equity and inclusivity within climate assemblies. And that pretty much very quickly gets us to the table, which again, I realize there's kind of small writing on here, but I thought I'd put it on a slide because there's this sort of, you could argue this is the crux of the framework. And just to go through the main, so well, there's 2 dimensions. At the top, we can see different types of impacts, and we've looked at instrumental impacts, capacity impacts, and conceptual impacts. Instrumental impacts are really about new ways of doing things, new ways of acting on climate, whereas capacity impacts are more around new expertise or increased resources, for example, that are useful for acting on climate change. And conceptual impacts are changing the way that we think or understand climate change, but also how we might act on climate, or how we encourage climate action. Obviously, these are not mutually exclusive categories. They integrate in lots of different ways. And actually, you know, when you start trying to put examples into these, it can be quite difficult to decide, does one come before the other? But generally, I think it's just important to say that there are different types of impacts that could be had, and to pay attention to those. And we also differentiate on a second dimension between areas of impact. So currently we're looking at them in terms of impacts on state actors. This is probably the most familiar to people in the field, because a lot of focus has been on policy impacts of climate assemblies. So these are impacts at national or regional kind of government decision-making level. So the kind of level of analysis might be what policymakers are saying, what politicians are doing, parliamentarians, civil servants, and so on. But particularly for climate assemblies, I think it's important to consider that there are also impacts on non-state actors and civil society. And actually this group of impacts is quite large. So if you think about impacts on wider society and also public discourse, so changing how the public might think about climate, or what organizations and civil society organizations do. And again, we can think about instrumental, capacity, and conceptual impacts. And so examples here might be an instrumental impact of on the media, might be changing their kind of the way that they produce content, or the tone of their content, and how they talk about climate. And that might change as a result of something that comes out of Climate Assembly. But also similarly, it incorporates kind of behavior change by assembly members or the broader public, although that's probably harder to trace. Capacity impacts are things like new networks or coalitions or new resources that organizations are providing or creating to act on climate change, for example, in this case. And then conceptual impacts in this case might be things like changing broader public, the way that climate change is perceived, for example, by the broader public or by particular key members of influential organizations. Last but certainly not least, we also have this type of impact, which is systems and structures. So we debated quite a lot whether to include this, because it essentially overlaps quite a bit with some of the other categories, but we thought it was really important because, again, climate change requires us to think about transformative changes in order to kind of, and the underlying sort of economics and foundations of society, and whether they or how they need to change in order for us to live in a world that reduces carbon emissions significantly. So this category is really about kind of impacts on underlying systems and structures, and what that might look like. And you'll see when I go through some examples, there's not that many examples because Climate Assemblies has really struggled to get at these kinds of more transformational changes. So things like thinking about kind of changing the social contract, or the kind of the relationship between citizen and state, or changing national constituencies to kind of think about or our economic structures, I suppose. Right, I will leave it there, but do feel free to obviously look into this table in more detail, and I'll continue on to give you a couple of examples, but again, go and have a look at part 2 if you want to read further on this. This slide is really just to remind myself that, as I said, these kind of categories that we've presented are fluid, and they are indicative, and they're not meant to be rigid in that way. And also the examples that we've given are indicative, and they're certainly not exhaustive, and we're always interested to hear about other examples that people might have. So just to give you a flavour of the kinds of things that are in the report. So for example, there's a suggestion, for example, that many climate assemblies have impacted policy. Changed kind of national energy or climate plans. We've seen this in Luxembourg, for example, but I've put plus because we've seen it in other places as well. And there are some analyses that look specifically at what within those plans might be traced back because of the influence of a climate assembly specifically. We also know that, well, there's been some analysis, for example, in Ireland, as a result of their climate assembly, that media reporting changed to account for the way that the climate assembly made recommendations on what we should do on climate and biodiversity. We struggled to find systemic or structural impacts, but again, this is not surprising, and there is more resources out there that look at or analyze the way that climate assemblies deal with these more transformational and systemic issues. And it's very difficult. So it's not surprising that that hasn't really been an intended aim of climate assemblies. We also have looked at capacity impacts. So a lot of the times where this falls is looking at the importance of public engagement and public participation, or more deliberative fora for informing climate decision making. And we can see this, for example, there's kind of moves towards permanent climate assemblies in Brussels. There's some in Milan. I think there's an example in Denmark. I have recently heard there's also more interest in this in the UK now. So there's this move towards more permanent structures, which might provide capacity for climate input in decision making. We also looked at capacity impacts for non-state actors, and there are multiple here because this category is very diverse. But an example would be assembly members from a climate assembly coming together to create associations or networks to follow up on their recommendations and advocate for changes that they recommended. So we have some examples of this in multiple countries. But again, the systems and structures impact is currently empty, but there's some suggestions in the report for what they might look like. And then finally, the conceptual category examples might be, for example, hearing notable shifts in the way that politicians talk about different priorities or different topics. And we see this after the Irish Citizens Assembly, for example. There's also been quite a bit of analysis, particularly of public perceptions of recommendations that come out of climate assemblies and perceptions of some of the policies or suggestions. And we can see that some climate assemblies can influence public discourse in that way and heightened awareness of some of these issues in the broader public, not just amongst assembly members. And then here we have a suggestion in the systems and structures category. Because some climate assemblies have incorporated, or the outcomes of them in terms of recommendations have incorporated more wide-ranging, kind of more what you might consider systemic suggestions, like discussions of wider constitutional change, like the rights of nature and ecocide, for example, in the French Assembly. So these are just some of the examples, and I think I spend a bit of time on this because this is really the crux of the framework, but I will also go through some of the rest of the considerations that we present in the report. When we think about impact, it's not just thinking about the diversity of impact, although of course that's very important, but also understanding what is happening in the short term and the long term, and understanding how to trace impacts over time. So it's really important to think that perhaps initially, right after an assembly, there's loads of new resources that come about, but are they maintained over the long term? Or, is there a suggestion of a policy proposal? Does that actually turn into legislation further down the road? So it's understanding what happens over time and tracing impacts. We also highlight the fact that we need to think about, so actually I'm moving up quite fast here, but we can think about the kind of long-term versus short-term nature of impacts across both instrumental capacity and conceptual impacts. We also highlight the need to think about the significance and reach of any kind of outcomes from a climate assembly. So we've borrowed this from other organizations, but we're really highlighting that we should think about how significant impact is, so how important the impact is, or how effective it is, for example. So there might be a new proposal or a new policy, but if it's actually ineffective in making any other changes in society in terms of what organizations do or what people do, then we can question how significant a particular impact has been. We also wanted to highlight the importance of thinking about the reach of assemblies. So how far does the impact travel? How far does it go? But that should probably be evaluated in context of the remit and the scope of an assembly. So I'm thinking if there is a national assembly, impact should probably be evaluated at a national level, or if it's at a local level, what is the kind of the sphere of influence that a local government, for example, has, and are they reaching that kind of that local kind of change, and also in terms of scope and remit. So, for example, is the climate assembly recommendations impactful in various sectors but not others? So recommendations on, for example, food might be picked up, but on travel they're completely ignored. So thinking about the significance and reach of impacts of the climate assembly as a whole is important. And then we also kind of talk at length about pathways to impact, and including the barriers and the enabling factors for achieving these. So that might be various different contextual factors. So if you think about, and there have been KNOCA publications on this, thinking about the design of the assembly and everything that happens around it. Does it kind of foster the kind of context in which certain impacts might materialize or not? So, for example, if you want to have broader impact on public discourse, it's probably good to have a broader public engagement strategy alongside the climate assembly and things like that. But also paying attention to things like the political context and how that enables or hinders recommendations being taken up. For example, I mean, there are lots here in terms of enabling factors, so it's important to kind of think that through. And there are some other issues here around cause and effect, and thinking about whether it's the climate assembly that has actually caused something or whether something was happening already. The climate assembly is just one small bit that's driving that forward. And also thinking about what the intentions were and planning to think about impacts. It's this idea that you might have impacts beyond what was initially planned for because of the context has changed or the recommendations have been taken up in a different way, for example. And just to illustrate, we've included this kind of pyramid, and again, this is just one example, but we've included this pyramid to kind of show that it's difficult to think about where to stop or what is an intended impact, because you could say in a kind of climate sphere, the main impact should be reductions in carbon emissions, but that is one view, right? You might have that view, but the further up you go, the impact is potentially more significant and far-reaching, but it's much harder to trace impact of climate assemblies because successfully reducing emissions will require action and on lots of scales, and there'll be lots of contributing factors. So it's thinking about how recommendations from a climate assembly might relate to some of these higher level impacts and how to trace them. And that also becomes a kind of methodological question, which is the next set of considerations, 6, 7, and 8, are really about collecting data for evaluations, because it is a tricky thing to look at one moment or a particular moment in time when a climate assembly is happening or when the recommendations come out, and then what happens afterwards and all of the other factors that contribute to what happens afterwards. So again, this is not a how-to guidebook, but we make some broad conceptual or methodological suggestions about what to think about, and particularly thinking about a broad range of methods to collect relevant data on impacts and making sure the methods align with the types of data and impacts that you're looking at. And also triangulating it across multiple data types and sources. And that's particularly important. This kind of data triangulation is if there isn't complete data on certain things, or for example, if there isn't any kind of pre-assembly data to compare it to, and you're just relying on post-assembly data, it's important to kind of corroborate different data sources to understand what or trace the impact that might have been had, and also to kind of think about biases that different sources of data might present. The other point that's really important, and it'll fall out of the previous recommendations, that we need to collect data at multiple time points, including ideally before, during, and after the assembly. So in some respects, that's really, really obvious to say. So for example, if you want to trace how an assembly is or isn't impacting on public perceptions more broadly, you want to know what it was beforehand and what it was afterwards. But this could also be around policy. Policy documents don't stay online for very long often. So it's to understand how policy documents might have changed. You might do some documentary analysis before an assembly takes place. And then this idea of collecting contextual information is really important. So understanding the broader context in which the climate assembly is happening, and what's happening around it, as well as the kind of the design of the climate assembly, who is paying attention to it, what's the political context, what's the media saying, to understand where the climate assembly might be having influence, or where there might be barriers for influence. And again, we are sort of providing a systematic way of thinking about this, and I won't go into loads of detail about this, but this is probably an area in which we would like to explore further how exactly to do evaluations. But it's important to think about what impact indicators might be. So if you, there's a list here that we've provided. So if you might want to look at, for example, a new law or a new policy, or recommendations from formal advisory body that mirror the recommendations from the Climate Assembly, for example, then think if that's the kind of impact that you're looking for to evaluate, what kind of evidence sources are there to look at whether the Climate Assembly has influenced that kind, like, for example, a policy area, to think about the kinds of sources that you could collect. And again, there's a list here. And then I think it becomes important to think about how to evidence the link to the Climate Assembly. So that's the evidence content. So things like spoken references to the Climate Assembly in kind of speech in parliaments or in politicians' kind of speeches, text in documentation that make direct reference to climate assemblies and things like that, to kind of show a causal link between what the Climate Assembly recommended and what actually happened in real life afterwards. And there's some examples here as well. And then we have a couple of recommendations also on the governance of evaluations. And again, these mirror what's already out there, but trying to translate it a little bit into the Climate Assembly context, which can be very complex. But foremost, we restate the need to have independent evaluation teams. But also, I think this is a point that was made in peer review quite strongly, is that we need to have integrated teams. And that's because if we need lots of data before, during, and after, and we need to corroborate across different types of data sources, really teams need to have access to lots of different data sources, and integrating teams properly in the Climate Assembly process usually or better enables that. And then the other recommendation that we have is that anyone who is evaluating or commissioning evaluations looks at getting relevant expertise, for example, on the methods that you need to look at different types of impact. So depending on what impact you choose to look at, figure out which methods might be most useful to collect the types of data that you need to evidence that impact, and gain in getting the expertise around those methods and those insights. So for example, if you're interested in public perceptions, you might ask someone like me who's an expert in this, whereas if you're interested in policy analysis, you might ask someone who's a policy analyst. And also ensuring there's enough resources and time, obviously, to include all that expertise. Right, I think there are other resources and some thoughts on next steps. I think I've already mentioned some of them. So we're really interested in thinking more broadly about indicators of impact, for example, and collecting evidence on the actual impact that climate assemblies are having. So it feels like it's been a long time for this to be published, but it also feels like the start. So I don't know where that leaves us, but that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. That was really a comprehensive introduction to what you've done. We're joined now as well by my colleague Mark Beanland from Democracy X, who's also he's a senior manager at Democracy X and is also one of the project leads for KNOCA, who worked with Christina and Stuart. And actually, Mark, I'll give Christina a chance to sip her tea. Mark, I've kind of come to you, and one of the things I say is you're someone who's run Climate Assemblies, and also, your organisation has been running deliberative processes for like the past 25 years. And I kind of want to ask you about the practical challenges of commissioning impact evaluations, because my experience is that most assemblies don't have impact evaluations. So from someone who's working in the field, what do you think the practical challenges are of us trying to see more evaluations actually happen?
Well, thank you, first of all, to Christina for a great presentation. And if I may actually just toss in an extra thank you to all the people who helped have a closer look at this. It's been a collaborative effort of pretty much all of the KNOCA network. So thank you for all those contributions. Well, it's a difficult question to answer and also kind of a straightforward question at the same time, because the truth is that evaluations they're their own thing, in the sense that, first of all, as Christina highlighted very well, there's a certain type of competence that needs to be in place if you want to do evaluations. So first of all, I'm a practitioner and I represent a skill set for organizing, designing, and facilitating assemblies, right? But very often the people hired to do that are not skilled evaluators. Similarly, we have the strong principle that we want third-party facilitators. We want someone to be a part of the organizational team that doesn't have a stake or a vested interest. But quite similarly, we actually also want the evaluators to be external, not only to the commissioners or to the people who are organizing or who want the assembly to happen, but also to the ones who are organizing it. Because there's a lot of interest at play once you have an assembly happening. So, for example, a commissioner may not be too interested in evaluations that are critical of whether it was meaningful to host the assembly in the first place. And an organizer may also not be too interested in evaluators critiquing the way they've done things. So it's quite complicated, because essentially it comes down to who has an actual interest in wanting to fund an evaluation taking place. And as Christina rightly highlighted, it's complicated to do evaluations. It's particularly complicated to do it well. So it requires resources and time. So there's a very natural question to be asked. How do you find someone who's willing to invest in this effort? And I think it's a natural question not to expect commissioners to want to do so unless they are somehow encouraged to do so because it has a benefit to them as well, which could be to say that there's transparency, for example, in the process to give it additional legitimacy, or to be able to tell the story of how the outcomes of an assembly are actually, how there is real impact and that it continues after the assembly finishes. And that kind of brings me to another point, if I can throw that in now as well, which is that Christina alluded to this too, but there's the thing about impact, that impact has this issue when it comes to time. That very often, you have this sense that when you do an assembly, you expect impact to happen very quickly. But the truth is, impact doesn't happen the moment you have finished recommendations. That's only when it begins. So when an assembly finishes and the budget for the assembly finishes, typically that's when impact starts to take place, in a sense, right? That's when all the effects of what you've been trying to do start to happen. And not only that, but for some of these complicated issues, the impact doesn't necessarily manifest until a long time after you're done working. So you don't only have to fund someone doing an evaluation and then, finish it and do a checkbox on it when the assembly ends. No, you actually have to have someone following the results for a long time to try to figure out whether these impacts are in fact manifesting over time too. So doing evaluations is incredibly difficult. It requires a particular skill set, it requires resources, and there are actually interests in place that might not want to do so. So that leaves kind of an open question. Who are the right people to ensure that evaluations take place? Who are the right ones to want to fund it? How much can you make it an obligation of the commissioners to ensure that this is also in place? I could say much more, but I feel like
I think one of the I mean, many interesting things you said, but one of the really interesting things that I think is really problematic here is the funding cycles of commissioners and also foundations. So you might think, oh, it will be foundations that would do this, but they typically work on an annual cycle as well. And if we're thinking about some of the impacts of the French Convention not actually appearing until 3 or 4 years later, that's not the kind of cycle that particularly much of our funding appears now. And that's for me is a real worry, that being able to actually fund a team that would actually stick with a process for that long is quite a difficult thing to do. Quick question from Tessa on this, Mark. Do you think that they should always be made public, these impact evaluations?
Mm-hmm. My immediate reaction is yes. I think, though, in honesty, there are different aspects of the evaluations too, right? So we kind of, Christina, you were saying this in the beginning too, like the first evaluations we've seen have been evaluations on the process itself, like simple elements of, was it a good process design? Did the experience of the participants make it sound like it was positive, in one way or another? But evaluation is really many, many things, and there's many aspects of an assembly that you could look at. And I can't rule out that there might be situations, for example, where public authorities might want to do very thorough investigations on whether they supported the assembly well enough, and they might not want to publicize that. But the thing is, we as a community of practice really want to learn how not only to do assemblies that are nice and give people a good experience, but essentially we're in the game because we want to make some sort of a change. So impact is something that we don't only want to discuss it in fluffy terms. We actually need some sort of an evidence of what creates impact, what supports impact. And if we don't have evaluations, how can we have a qualified discussion about that? But we need them to be public, and we need them to be something we can scrutinize and debate.
Christina, did you have anything to add on that at all? Or
loads, but let's just 2 points really. One, on this point about evaluations and the funding cycles and all of those kinds of things. I mean, if we think about the perfect evaluations, probably it's not possible because the resources are just not going to be there. But then if we're in the game to show, for example, and that is a bias in a way, but to show that these kinds of climate assemblies can have certain types or all of these impacts. Actually, I talk to policymakers all the time and trying to get more of this kind of stuff up and running in the UK, for example, and they always want to see evidence. So there's something about even collecting evidence at this point as a community to show what impact can be had or where the barriers are, how best to do things in order to have certain types of impact, to make the case for climate assemblies in a way, or certain types of deliberative kind of citizen engagement. So I was thinking, there are other funding avenues, and I've been thinking about, there are academics like myself who also to some extent have some of these expertise, which is the second point about, I think, different impacts or evaluating different types of impacts will require different types of expertise. I think there's a question in the chat about that. And some of these expertise are practitioners, really, and that's not my area at all. But it's combining that with academic expertise. So if you think about, I don't know anything really about process tracing, but I know that there are really, good methods being developed around process tracing and policy and analysis and all of those kinds of things. But I do know a lot about public discourse, public understandings, and societal impacts. So it's combining the right expertise, academic and practitioner, and maybe getting together and looking for kind of creative funding sources if they're not going to be commissioned in that way at the start of an assembly because of the context.
There's a comment in there which I think is important to maybe slight misunderstanding. Fergus makes this point that impact can start at any, from the moment, and actually from the moment an assembly is even conceived, that starts having repercussions. And I think my experience here is too many of the evaluations of impact we have are post hoc. They're actually organised after the assembly has happened, which means there's a whole set of data and impacts that you miss. Because, that, which is, I think, Christina, your point, and Mark, your point, that actually you need to be starting collecting this data early in order that you can actually see these impacts happen during the assembly and after the assembly and long term. And that is a real challenge of getting that team embedded early, because everyone's so, I just had a call today with some public officials, and they're so focused on getting the assembly done. And they're kind of almost thinking, well, we can think about follow-up and evaluation afterwards. But unless you're, in the same way that we've been arguing, you need to design this follow-up process at the start, you also need to be designing the evaluation from the start. And that's really, again, that's another real challenge for us to get that into the minds of commissioners. And, you're talking about get potential academic sources of funding, trying to get the funding in time for the actual thing to start. I mean, we're always, our funding timelines are so long that actually that's deeply problematic. Not that, sorry, this is beginning to become a very negative thing. I don't want this to be negative, because it's an incredibly positive development because in putting this on the agenda, but there are so many sort of practical challenges of actually getting this done. Someone actually asked, have we actually seen an example of evaluation being embedded well? I'd be really interested to know if anyone has seen that. I mean, the best I've seen, actually, probably personally, is in Scotland, but that ended after 9 months. So they had funding for 9 months, kind of like they followed the assembly all the way through, and then their report is for the 9 months after. But of course, most of the impacts are going to be after that, but they were actually very embedded. Have you seen anything, Mark or Christina, or is it just at the moment an aspiration?
Well, I can throw in that there are obviously different types of processes that mirror climate assemblies. For example, I can think of the Conference on the Future of Europe that had a very dedicated evaluation team that started along with the beginning of the conceptualization of the process and followed for a long time after. But in the realm of climate assemblies, I don't think we've seen much of that. And obviously it's down to probably, in part, resources. But also I think that there hasn't been much of an awareness around the need for this. So when it comes to this idea of tracking impact, obviously one of the things that I like particularly about this new version of the framework is that it speaks to the notion of pathways to impact. And pathways to impact are not easy to deal with, because obviously if you want to say something about a change, you'll not only need to see what happens after an assembly, you will have to know what was there in the beginning, So to Angela's point, who's talking about whether you can split data collection and data analysis into two separate jobs, I mean, yes, in a sense, because there's a lot of data collection that's relevant, and some of it might start before. Some of it might also be done by someone who's not actually a part of the evaluation. But if you don't have good data at various times of a process, it's very hard to track what is happening based on the outcomes of an assembly. And then when you add these many levels of complexity, that all sorts of other things are impacting things too, being able to tell the story of why your assembly is the one having an impact is just very difficult.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. I have a thought for you as well, Christine. I'm interested for you to think. I think you kind of mentioned this was actually this conceptualization of impact, and I think Mark said a similar kind of thing, is actually potentially really helpful for designers of processes, because actually you can sit down and think, well, what is it we are trying to achieve? And if we're trying to achieve that, what kind of things do we need to put in place in order that there is a pathway to impact? So actually having this kind of framework is really important for evaluation. But maybe we've actually underplayed the fact that this actually could be really important resource for planning as well, for commissioners, for organisers. And actually this is a way of thinking about assemblies that could be really useful. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yes. I mean, we definitely talked about that when we were setting up sort of who's the audience for this document or this framework. And actually also we included sort of additional reading of other KNOCA briefings that speak specifically about this point. That if you should think about, or ideally you'd think about what kind of impact you would like to achieve. And then there is starting to be some kind of thoughts and evidence on what you need to put in place to achieve those impacts for sure. And there is starting to be, we're talking about there isn't, good examples of embedded evaluations, but there is starting to be analysis of some of this, right? So, the importance of, for example, talking to politicians beforehand, and integrating them into the process. I've seen other, there's a lot of even citizen assembly members initiatives or other organizations that are set up to really track what happens, for example, in the French case with a policy and whether it gets watered down, what gets taken up. So there is sort of almost kind of citizen or kind of broader civil society kind of science that's going on in this space. So there is an element of kind of capturing some of that is helpful. But it's, I guess, in terms of maybe the kind of rigor and reliability that is required to kind of convince people that these things are having an effect independent of other factors, we might need more robust evaluations as well. Sure.
There's a couple of comments in here which I don't need to directly point to, but Tim Dorr was talking about, if it impacts on elections being one possible category. Fergus was talking about how if we actually see greater participation and permanent assemblies, maybe that's actually systemic and structural rather than just purely instrumental. That actually does speak to the challenges that the three of us and, well, four of us, because Stuart as well, had going, where does this fit? And actually, it's really interesting. You can create this kind of like conceptual map, but actually we've got to recognize that these are, as I think you said, these are categories that do slip into each other, and that there's going to be a matter of judgment in terms of trying to actually apply it.
Yeah, specifically, especially with the systems and structures one, because ultimately, they could probably be subsumed into some of the other categories. But I think it was really important to highlight the importance of those kinds of impacts because of how relevant they are for climate action specifically. But it's an interesting one, impacts on election, some of those examples that we might not have captured yet. But I think the permanent assembly ones, I think we preliminarily categorized it as potentially systemic.
Yeah. Maybe we need another category, potentially systemic, rather.
But if I can
getting an insight in the conversations that we've had for years.
Yeah, I know.
But it's not about categorizing without, with certainty. It's about thinking about the breadth of impacts. So.
Exactly. And I think that's a really, really important point about that breadth of impact and getting away from, it's all about just policy. Policy is just one out of 9 categories. Sorry, Mark, as usual, I jumped in.
Right. Well, basically, I wanted to say the same thing. I think one of the things that we've been missing in the debate has been a starting point for this conversation, which I hope the framework can be, because it's not like we have now, finalized the perfect conceptual framework necessarily, but we have something to talk about now. So we can discuss where the things fit. What might we be missing? Is there something that we've given too much or not too little attention, etc.? So I'm actually really curious to see how this framework will be used. I'm really interested in being in that discussion with people around. Where does what fit and what is important to talk about? Which things should have more attention and less? But I think this is exactly the point with having now made this. It's also with the first version, of course, that Christina and Stuart made. So it's not, in that sense, we're not groundbreaking with this. But I think the new version of this framework is a great source of having these debates and in a qualified way.
And I just want to say thank you to Michelle, who's just put in saying that they're currently using the KNOCA evaluation. We really appreciate that. And we are indeed going to watch this space, and we'll advertise it when it comes out. We're not shy of taking credit for things, so thank you. Just as we finish, Christina and Mark, you kind of both mentioned this, but if we're going to take this work forward, which I think we should, what's the next stage? What would you like? So we've got this framework. What would you like to see happen now? Either through let's just say, what would you like to see KNOCA do now in terms of we've got this framework? Where do we as a network go now? Christina, do you want to say?
Sure. Yeah. It's not fully thought through, and actually I'm getting ideas about what I want to do as well, so I might get back in touch. But I mean, one of the things that we wrote about is this idea. I mean, we stopped short of really providing more practical guidance and going into the detail. So we started talking about indicators, for example, and it got very big very quickly, and it's not the same across all national contexts. But thinking a little bit more about what are indicators and evidence of impact, which I think would be really helpful. And also if someone else wants to get into that would be really helpful, I think, for other guidance for the network. I also think the network, and I'd be really interested in getting involved in this, is really collecting, synthesizing the evidence on impacts across different climate assemblies and what we can learn. So not just about sharing knowledge, but also, synthesizing and learning from that to kind of provide an evidence base of what is happening, what's not happening, and how it's the pathways, I suppose. I think that's the whole purpose of the framework, is to be more kind of systematic about it. So if we can collect evidence in that way, that would be a really helpful next step, I think.
Mark, yourself, I mean, you can actually, we're starting to walk along that way a little bit, but what would you like to see happen, Mark?
Well, I mean, I can say that what we are starting to do now is we're trying to find and host evaluations on the website. So within a reasonably short amount of time, you'll be able to see some of these evaluations that are made around climate assemblies showing up on the KNOCA website. And for example, we did this workshop on the French Assembly 5 years on, which we hosted just before Christmas. And I think that's also an interesting format, because for a lot of evaluations on impact, obviously you can't have really qualified debates about what happened until sometime after the fact, So we're also seeing now, with where we are on the wave of assemblies, we're at a point where we can actually start to have some of these conversations about where did these assemblies take us and what did they bring about. So yeah, on a very practical level, I think we can host these conversations, and we can even host evaluations and be able to point people in the direction of different evaluations.
Yeah.
If we're lucky, there will be other people using this framework so that we can also kind of compare across assemblies, which would be very interesting.
Yeah, so that's really a request. If anyone sees any really interesting evaluations, we'll also host process evaluations. We're not only going to look at impact evaluations. So please do share those. So look, I want to take this opportunity while Christina and Mark are in to actually thank both of them for all the work they've done, and particularly Christina for sticking with us for so long. And in fact, Stuart, who's not here today, started even earlier working with us. Maybe he's not here today because he's had enough of working with us. But thank you to the three of you for this work, for putting this work in, getting that impact evaluation framework out there. It is a really important contribution to both, not just on climate assemblies, actually, on citizens assemblies, in fact, on participatory processes generally, that we have some sort of systemic way to collect and to analyse impact. So I'd like to say how grateful we are on behalf of the network.